Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Rowe. We're looking at lesson 11 in Algebra 2A. We're focusing on numbers 3, 4, and 5. These are the problems that require you to use the quadratic formula. So let's get started. So here's a simple example. And remember that when we use the quadratic formula, we're focusing on the fact that the equation is in standard form. So standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And so what we need to do is we need to find the values for a, b, and c. And that's all we need to worry about. So we're just looking for that value, and that value. We're not worried about anything else, x squared, x's, nothing else. So what is a, b, and c in this first problem? Well, the first term, x squared, doesn't have a visible coefficient. But remember, we always assume that there is a 1 right there as its coefficient. So that means that a in this one is going to equal 1. B will then equal n, and c is going to equal 25. And so that's the values we're going to use. And so what is the quadratic formula? Quadratic formula is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So there's the formula. And so now we just substitute and solve. Plug and chug, as we used to call it. So x is going to equal the opposite of b. B is 10, so that's going to be negative 10 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 10 squared. And then we got to subtract 4 times a. A is 1 times c. C is 25. And that's all divided by 2 times a, which is 1. There we go. That's better. And I'll move that negative up. Don't worry about that. And now it's just all in orders of operation. So we got to start off in the radical. So 10 squared. 10 squared is 100. So we got the opposite of 10, plus or minus square root. 10 squared is 100. And then we're going to multiply. Negative 4 times 1 times 25. And it's a negative because we're going to treat this like it's a negative 4. That's how we treat it. Can't treat it any other way. So negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times 25 is negative 100. And that's all divided by 2 times 1. And we can go ahead and do that. That's 2. And so what happens in the radical? We got 100 minus 100, which is 0. So that's going to end up giving us x equals the opposite of 10. And then 0 just goes away, divided by 2. So that means this one has one answer, and it's negative 5. So there you go. That's how you apply the quadratic formula here. Let's take a look at our next example. I'm going to go a little bit quicker on the rest of the examples. I'm going to show you kind of the important, steps when we get there, the kind of last ones I really want to focus on. So let's take a look here. Well, first of all, this is not standard form. So remember, standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Well, this form is not that. So what do I have to do? Well, I've got to get the 4x to the opposite side. So I'm going to add 4x to each side. That's going to isolate, or that's going to get everything on one side by itself. And we want to make sure that we write it in the right form. The x term has to go in the center. The linear term, or the term without an x, has to be the third term. So we have to write it in that order. That's the most common mistake I'm seeing people make, is when they move that over, they're not putting terms in the correct order. And the signs do matter, so make sure you understand that as well. So there we go with that. So now, identify A, B, and C. A equals 3. E equals 4. C equals -4. Watch the signs. Make sure you don't forget them. Quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all divided by, and let me just start over. Writing too fast sometimes with this and you don't get it right. The opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2A. So substitute, plug, and chug, as I said in the last one. So the opposite of B in this case is 4. So this will be -4, plus or minus the square root B squared, -4 squared, minus 4. You notice I put, this is important too, before I move on. When I substitute a negative value in for B, and actually this wasn't a negative value, so I need to fix that. But when you substitute a negative value, make sure you put the negative value in parentheses. That 4 shouldn't have been negative, but hopefully we'll see an example like that in just a minute so I can explain that a little further. -4 times A is 3, times C, which is -4. That's all divided by 2 times A, which is 3. Work the radical first. So start with this part. What's negative, or what's positive 4 squared? Positive 4 squared is 16. -4 times A times C. Let's go ahead and work that out. If you don't know it, pull out your calculator. -4 times 3 times -4. That's 48. And that's going to actually end up being plus 48. You notice this was a plus, or this is a positive 48, so that's going to be plus 48. I forgot my plus or minus sign there. All divided by 2 times A, 2 times 3 is 6. We can go ahead and do that. It won't hurt nothing to go ahead and do that. So in the radical, we got 16 plus 48. So 48 plus 16 is 64. Look at that, a perfect square root. That's something we like to see. So x equals -4 plus or minus the square root of 64, all divided by 6. So we take the square root of 64. Square root of 64 is 8. So then we have x negative 4 plus or minus 8, all divided by 6. And so now you get two answers. So make sure you give me both answers. So we've got one answer, which is negative 4 plus 8 divided by 6. That's our first answer. Our second answer is x equals negative 4 minus 8 divided by 6. All right, so if we work out this first one, negative 4 plus 8 is 4 over 6, which will reduce to 2/3. So there's our first answer. All right, second one, negative 4 minus 8. Well, that's negative 12 divided by 6 is negative 2. And there's your second answer. So yeah, that's a lot of work, and that's what I need to see. You showing me each step. That way, if you make an error somewhere, I can just point that mistake out so you can go back and fix it. That's why I want you to show your work. All right, so here's the next one. Well, this one is nowhere near standard form. So we've got a couple of options here. We can add 3x and subtract 20, which is what I'm going to do. Or we could subtract 2x squared from each side, either one. So I'm going to subtract and then end up with 2x squared plus 3x minus 20 equals 0. And if you need to see those steps, just send me a teacher message and I'll show them to you. All right, so again, we're looking for A, B, and C. A equals 2, B equals 3, C equals negative 20. So again, quadratic formula. I'm going to write it down every time, and you should too. X equals the opposite of B, plus or minus square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2A. Plug and chug. All right, opposite of B. So that's going to be negative 3 plus or minus B squared, which is 3 squared, minus 4 times A, which is 2, times C, which is negative 20, all divided by 2 times A, which is 2. And I'll change that Y there in just a second. Okay, that Y is supposed to be 4. And again, simplify the radical. 3 squared is 9. And then 4 times 2 times negative 20. Negative 4 times 2 times negative 20. So that gives me plus 160, all divided by 2 times 2 is 4. I can go ahead and do that. And so again, simplify the radical some more. Square root of 169, all divided by 4. And square root of 169, if you're not sure, second square root 169. Look at that, works out to be a perfect square root, which is 13. So then this becomes x equals the opposite of 3 plus or minus 13, all divided by 4. And so now you just set up your two different solutions. X equals negative 3 plus 13, all divided by 4. So there's your first solution. Second solution, x will equal negative 3 minus 13, all divided by 4. Okay, first solution, negative 3 plus 13 is negative 10, or excuse me, positive 10, Mr. Riddle, divided by 4. That's going to reduce to 5 halves. So there's your first solution. Second solution, negative 3 minus 13 is negative 16. You divide that by 4, you get negative 4. So plug and chug, just make sure you follow the orders of operations, and this really shouldn't be more difficult than that. Oops. All right. This is my last example. Yep, last example here. Again, just like the last couple, not in standard form. So I'm going to subtract 16. 16 is the linear term, so it'll go last. So we'll end up with 10x squared plus 8x minus 16 equals 0. And sometimes when you do these, you kind of want to notice something that makes life easier. And what I notice about these is all three of these values are divisible by 2. So I'm going to divide them by 2 to make my numbers smaller. So that's going to give me 5x squared plus 4x minus 8 equals 0. Make a big deal? Well, you'd get the same answer, you just might have to simplify before you do it. So let's take a look. So opposite of b, plus or minus b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So plug and check. Opposite of b, plus or minus b squared minus 4 times a, which is 5, times c, which is negative 8. All divided by 2 times 5. So work the radical. So 4 squared is 16. And you notice I'm doing this part in 2 steps. It just makes it a lot easier not to make an error if you do it this way. 4 squared is 16, and then negative 4 times 5 times negative 8. And you see it's positive, so it's plus 160. All divided by 2 times 5 we can do, that's 10. All right, we're going to add 16 and 160 to get 176. And that's divided by 10. And let's see. I'm pretty sure this is not a perfect square root. No, it's not a perfect square root, so that means I'm going to have to simplify the radical. We're not going to use decimals. So we're going to have to work with 176. And I know it's divisible by 2. All right, let's see 176. Let's see if it's divisible by 4. Okay, so let's see if it's divisible by 16. Oh, look at that. And the reason I got 16 is because this is 44. 44 is 4 times 11. 4 times 4 is 16. I'm just playing around with the numbers until I get a factor. So I know that 16 times 11 equals 176. So that's what I'm going to use to simplify my radical. All right, and what I do here is I take the square root of 16 out of the radical. Square root of 16 is 4. That comes out of the radical. The 11 stays in the radical. So now the radical is simplified. And now basically the only thing I got left to do here is to see if the coefficients, these three values right here, this one, and this one, if they all reduce together. They're all divisible by 2. So this will reduce. So my final answer will be -2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 11, all divided by 5, because I divided each one of these values by 2. So that's the quadratic formula. Hopefully seeing these examples will refresh your memory. It should not be a new concept. So hopefully that refreshes your memory enough to get through the lesson. If it doesn't, please set up an appointment for a help session, or definitely send me a teacher message.